November 29th, 2016. Justin Trudeau strolls to a podium in Ottawa. He's made a decision one scribe would later write was bold and potentially dangerous. With the fate of 3 massive energy projects, including Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline, at stake.
And what this right here is, Kinder Morgan, they're not good.
4,000 kilometers away in Vancouver, this man, Reuben George, watched with great interest.
They threaten our mother, they threaten our livelihood, they threaten our connection to spirit.
Just over a year ago, Canadians elected a new government.
In this moment, the new Prime Minister must know oil sands pipelines
No more destruction
are one of the most divisive issues in Canadian politics. Polls in BC shows public support for pipelines declining.
I am outraged today.
Vancouver and Burnaby, along with a dozen other communities in the Lower Mainland, denounce it.
I won't stop making the case until Prime Minister Trudeau and his team make a definitive no decision.
But we can't continue to support Canada's economy unless Canada supports us.
But Alberta's economy is floundering. A few months earlier, addressing her own voters, Premier Rachel Notley applied pressure.
I won't let up. We must get to yes on a pipeline.
Considering international climate change commitments and keeping the promises he made to Indigenous people, make this a hard sell. Especially because of his commitment to reconciliation and respect of Indigenous peoples. In fact, many view this as a first test.
That strong action on the environment is good for the economy.
For those opposed, the speech starts off promising.
Clean air and water, beautiful coasts and wilderness, and refuse to accept that they must be compromised in order to create growth.
This is my favorite place in the world.
And then, 4.5 minutes in,
The Government of Canada has approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project.
I was very disappointed. You know, he's a liar.
This is a decision based on rigorous debate, on science, and on evidence.
He lies and says based on facts. I question those facts.
I remember the ship.
8 years ago, Reuben George began a battle to stop the $6.8 billion Kinder Morgan pipeline in its tracks. George isn't the only one left mistrusting Trudeau and his government.
I've talked to him face to face, and he promised me they were going to redo the Trans Mountain Pipeline review, and they swore up and down that Stephen Harper's National Energy Board process was inadequate and failed to secure social license and disrespected First Nations. They're going to redo the whole thing. They didn't do it.
And it's actually a betrayal of Canadians and First Nations that put a lot into that process.
And it's still not good for our economy. It's still not good for jobs.
Opponents are attacking the project on many fronts. First Nations not consulted. The economics just don't make sense, according to some analysts.
And they said, no, let's spend a little bit of our resources that we have and let's stop them. The elder stood up and said it's reason
And
enough
19 court challenges that put the approval under the microscope.
Well, some things only happen in British Columbia.
Add in a wild turn of events during the BC election that might spell doom for the pipeline. Many concerns are echoed by Kinder Morgan itself. In a prospectus recently uncovered, Kinder Morgan warns investors of many pitfalls putting their investment at risk. We will have more on that a little later. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation's homeland spans the Burrard Inlet, a 20-minute drive from downtown Vancouver.
My Uncle Len's house, my Auntie Pat.
This is your home.
Yeah, this is where I grew up.
They are neighbors with a tiny North Vancouver suburb. Deep Cove is a watery playground for locals and a hot tourist destination.
There'd be no less than sometimes 45 people out there harvesting clam and Dungeness crab. And
Development along the inlet means the way of life is long gone.
I used to say my kids won't experience what I experienced here because every stream used to have trout and salmon.
George quotes his famous actor and activist grandfather, Chief Dan George.
And those days are long gone, but my grandfather, Chief Dan George, sat right there, and he said, My children and grandchildren won't experience what I experienced here. And he said that in 1971.
Looking out across the inlet from their backyards, the Tsleil-Waututh can literally see the end of the line. Tankers have loaded oil here from Alberta since the late 50s. With this project, Kinder Morgan will triple the amount of tar sand bitumen flowing from Alberta to the BC coast, construct a new dock with the capacity to berth 3 much larger class of tankers. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation's fight is more than a promise of civil disobedience.
I can see the Thunderbird already.
We saw earlier some petroglyphs.
2,900 years old, eh?
Yeah. 2,900 years old?
They're carbon dated, yeah.
The nation will use its own independent assessments in court,
There's 27.
challenging both the National Energy Board and federal government, arguing the NEB hearings were inadequate.
Oh, yeah.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
It's in this little area there. I'd like to find out what that means, that one with the circle and 3 dots.
It's also an Aboriginal title test that leans heavily on the precedent set by Chilcotin.
We had villages up here of our territory.
That Supreme Court of Canada ruling states if the Crown begins a project without consent prior to Aboriginal title being established, it may be required to cancel the project upon the establishment of the title. Further up the inlet, at a place called Indian Arm,
The river runs really slow and goes pretty deep.
George explains it's here his ancestors performed an ancient coming-of-age ceremony.
The young boy who's turning into man will pick up a stone, and then he'll walk through the water and walk along the bottom with a stone. Of course, they come up on the other side, and they take that stone and they put that stone down with all of our other ancestors. They become a man. That's what we used to do up here.
George has no doubt they will prove title. In 2005, Texas company Kinder Morgan purchased the 1,100-kilometer Trans Mountain Pipeline, adding to a substantial pipeline network crisscrossing North America. And a number of Kinder Morgan executives have history at Enron, an infamous company. If you've forgotten, a press release from a prominent chief reminds us just what that past is. Both Richard Kinder and Bill Morgan were former Enron execs, but both left the company years before the collapse and were never implicated in any wrongdoing. The partners acquired Enron Liquid Pipelines in 1997 and Kinder Morgan was born. Its president and 3 vice presidents were plucked from Enron's ranks. No one at Kinder Morgan Canada was available for an interview. We had requested to talk to President Ian Anderson. While no wrongdoing has been found at Kinder Morgan, this activist says it's worth keeping it in mind.
Kinder Morgan has a dreadful safety record.
Since 2005, there have been 4 major spills along Trans Mountain's route. The most serious led to the evacuation of 250 residents in 2007 after a road crew excavator operator punctured the pipeline in Burnaby. 200,000 liters of oil gushed all over the neighborhood. There has never been a tanker spill in the Port of Vancouver. When we come back, an out-of-this-world provincial election could make this rookie MLA from the Sartlip Nation the most powerful man in this battle. It's the nightmare scenario that keeps Reuben George up at night. A large-scale tanker spill in Burrard Inlet and the possible harm to his family. The damages to the land in the area are considered one of the most livable in the world.
First thing I think of is my mom, because she wouldn't move, and she would have to, but she goes, no, I'd never leave my land. And so I think of her and having her pull her away and to have her live, because of, not if, but when a spill happens, 1 million people immediately will be sick. 500,000 birds will die, and everything will change. And it's like pouring oil on our family until they die, and that's what would happen here. it definitely wouldn't be the most livable place in the world. Industry or the government, like Minister Oliver said, why don't the First Nations take the money? They need it. But we don't need it more than sacrificing what we love, and that's this.
And so they resist. Here in Burnaby, for over a month, disturbing seismic testings back in 2014.
Sooner die than have Kinder Morgan come in here with their poison.
Over 100 protesters arrested. Some protesters faced civil suits. Kinder Morgan claimed damages that included allegations of assault, including intimidating facial expressions. Social media blew up. Eventually, the charges were dropped. And here in 2016, 3,000 march in Vancouver. And George has confronted them on the company's home turf.
I always been confident. The Canadian Constitution protects our Indigenous rights. You know, like I shared that with the shareholders down there in Texas, Houston, Texas, at their AGM meeting.
You know, we just, like I said, you want to make it the best project and get the most benefit that you can out of it. You know, not saying there aren't downsides, but I think there can be upsides as well.
In British Columbia, 24 First Nations and 2 Métis organizations have publicly supported the Kinder Morgan pipeline project, and some have received funds. We attempted to contact over 20 of them, and only 2 agreed to talk with APTN, including the Yale First Nation.
When you look at most First Nations administrations, you know, they're just funded for the bare bones, so there's no extras. And even when they are, you know, different grant opportunities come up, but they're very targeted. Whereas the money that you get through resource revenue agreements and revenue agreements such as these is there's no strings.
Recently, Chief Executive Ian Anderson offered First Nations ownership stake in the pipeline, saying, "We're a private company now. Our stock is traded. I would welcome the opportunity to have some First Nations investment in that." Which brings us back around to that prospectus. After approval, the pipeline needed financing to the tune of $6.8 billion. Dogwood Initiative has led a no-tanker campaign in BC since 2007. The organization published the paper. Kai Nagata says the company had a difficult time with financing.
And so that's when they started talking to the big teacher pension fund in Ontario, for example. And they couldn't find anybody.
In May, still needing close to $2 billion, the company went public, offering what's called an IPO, or initial public offering, or shares. Doing that requires complete transparency, hence the prospectus. It must disclose risks to the investment. It's a laundry list of what could go wrong.
Ian Anderson has publicly questioned the science of climate change in the past, but his lawyers in this prospectus say that one of the potential risks to the project is that rising sea levels could knock out the Westridge tanker terminal. So they say that the failure by the business to resolve issues relating to Aboriginal rights and title and the Crown's duty to consult could have a material adverse effect on the Trans Mountain. So what they actually say here, changes in the overall demand for hydrocarbons may have a negative impact on the supply of crude oil and other products.
Put another way, the decline of the oil business. Now this may be lawyers erring on the side of caution, just plain old due diligence. But on page 1 is this.
Investment in restricted voting shares should only be made by persons who can afford a significant or total loss of their investment.
Investors weren't scared off, however, and construction begins in September. It promises 15,000 jobs during construction and 37,000 jobs when it's up and running. And over 20 years, nearly $50 billion paid out in taxes. The company predicts selling to international markets will increase sales by $3.7 billion a year. Benefits based on a belief Asia will buy Canada's bitumen at a premium. This economist isn't buying that.
Markets in Asia for Alberta's heavy oil do not exist. Even though Kinder Morgan was granted special treatment by the NEB in 2012 to guarantee access to the Westridge dock so those markets could exist, could be developed, that has not occurred. Those attempts have failed. And secondly, prices in Asia are not higher than prices in North America for our heavy oil. So the markets aren't there, the prices aren't there, and therefore the benefits, the majority of the benefits that have been touted, do not exist.
It's quite a bit cheaper to get it to the U.S. Gulf Coast than it is to Northeast Asia. So because there's no basic price differential, between Asia and North America, you're going to be getting less if you ship it to Northeast Asia.
After 32 years at the Geological Survey of Canada, David Hughes now dedicates his time to the Post-Carbon Institute's mission to create a sustainable world. He says the U.S. is the only viable customer for Canada heavy oil. He also says new realities change Kinder Morgan's forecasts.
One of them, the NEB, the National Energy Board, revised downward their future Canadian oil supply forecast. And the second one was Rachel Notley in Alberta came out with their climate leadership plan, which had a 100 megaton emissions cap on the oil sands. So if you look at the effect of those two downgrades in terms of future oil supply, Kinder Morgan overestimated oil supply by something like 43%.
Alan reminds us there are already pipelines heading into the U.S. with more to come. Trudeau approved a second pipeline to the States called Line 3, and President Donald Trump just approved the Keystone XL.
Over the next decade, there's going to be more than enough capacity on pipelines to get the oil out. Trans Mountain is not needed, the capacity is not needed, and if it's built, significant capacity will lie idle, and that costs the Canadian economy.
All things considered, if we now have 3 approved pipelines, we don't need Trans Mountain, and environmentally Trans Mountain is the worst choice.
Alan explains it's attractive for oil producers as a backup. If disaster strikes like it did in Kalamazoo a few years ago, production won't stop.
So that's a business interruption kind of insurance for the oil industry.
As we heard, including the Tsleil-Waututh, there are 19 court cases against this project. The majority against Canada and the National Energy Board. Complaints are it did a poor job evaluating the project. Alan prepared an assessment for the Tsleil-Waututh, and she maintains her work is fair and unbiased. A former vice president of BC insurance agency ICBC, she was a qualified expert intervener at the hearings, but she walked away.
When I discovered that cross-examination had been removed from the process, I was very concerned because it is not a review. It is not a public interest review without cross-examination. You have to be able to test the evidence. I elected to resign from the process because to stay in endorsed a system that was not credible. And then, of course, my position was endorsed by Prime Minister Trudeau before he was elected, that the process was flawed, that it had been torqued, and that the report couldn't be trusted.
The sick thing about this whole process is that the level of disclosure that Kinder Morgan has to provide to investors is far higher than they have to provide in a national pipeline review.
In the prospectus, concern a change in the provincial government would mean more opposition to the pipeline now seems prescient after a stunning election night in May. The Liberal Party lost its majority. The NDP came in a close second, and the Green Party, with its 3 seats, now hold the balance of power. At the legislature, in a small basement corner office, the Greens are getting to work. They already have an accord signed with the NDP to work together. Green Party leader Andrew Weaver believes at this point that means opposing Kinder Morgan.
Like, nobody needs diluted bitumen. People need gasoline, they need jet fuel, they need refined products. Those haven't been demonstrated. Those were not challenged in the NEB process. Upstream effects on climate were not challenged. There's so much. The economic case was not challenged. There's so much that was not challenged in this. And the question is this even going to be built because of economic reasons?
If the NDP Green Alliance holds, that means one vote can make the difference. And this man from Sartlet First Nation could become one of the most influential people in the province.
We can't be dragging these projects through First Nations communities, through Indigenous territories, and on one hand say, oh, the rights of Indigenous people, we're going to uphold the UN Declaration of the Rights and Consent and all that language, and then on the other hand say the facts and the evidence proves that this is what we should be doing.
The one good thing about this coalition that's going to happen, that's going to be the loudest microphone that we'll have to amplify our message and educate the rest of Canada on the true facts of this destruction that it causes.
Praise for provincial politicians, but George barely contains his anger at the federal leader.
I have said many times that there isn't a country in the world that would find billions of barrels of oil and leave it in the ground while there is a market for it.
Did he talk to us about our reciprocal relationship or our 1,200-page document assessment of Kinder Morgan? Did we get the chance to talk about our 3 studies that we did on the likeliness of a spill, which is 92% chance, so it's not if but when, that you could only clean up 20%? That our second study, our third study, was it's not good for Canadian economy? No, they didn't. And those are world-renowned scientists and economists and people that we work with that came up with these true facts that we're going to educate Canada on. Because he failed at that, to looking out for the best interests of our lands and for our waters and for the people. Because they're dying and the water's dying and everything's, and look at this. There's no way we're going to let something happen to our lands and waters here.
From Standing Rock.
How does it feel? It makes me angry. It makes me angry because, you know, you see all this right here, they already have pipeline already. They're already building and they're destroying our land.
To missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Her story needs to be told because she is Native.
We also exposed poverty in the North.
Well, like, would you want to work? Like, if the opportunity was there for you?
Yes, I would like to work.
And questionable deals in Manitoba. Our reporters looked into deaths in Thunder Bay.
We were told that he died from drowning, but to this day, I never believed that he died from drowning.
And showed a fentanyl crisis out of control.
Right now, I don't think it matters what you're asking for. I think you're getting fentanyl no matter what you're asking for. When you're looking for heroin, you're getting fentanyl.
You can watch all of these stories and more on our website at aptnnews.ca/investigates. If you have a story idea and you want to contact us, here's how. Check out our Facebook page at facebook.com/aptninvestigates. Find us on Twitter at aptninvestigate, or send us an email at investigates@aptn.ca. Thanks for watching.